Hello. Welcome to another exciting edition of the TPMA Talks podcast. This month's presentation is entitled, Speaking Story and Your Product, introduced by Lee Garrison and presented by Dan Yashinsky. Enjoy.
As Charles said, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation tonight, and one in which you'll all get to participate quite a bit. So this all started back last summer at Product Camp. How many of you were at Product Camp last summer? A few, good, okay. So there was a session that came up at Product Camp called Storytelling. And at the time, you know, those of us that were on the organizing committee said, that's interesting. I wonder what that's about. Anyway, Lawrence Hourihan gave a talk and attended by quite a few people and sort of piqued my interest in what is this thing about storytelling? I mean, certainly I know what stories are, and it hadn't really occurred to me that we might be using those in business or in product management. So Lawrence really thankfully opened up our eyes a bit to it. And we decided to do this session this evening. I'll introduce Dan in a moment, but I wanted to start off with a few things that I found out in sort of my curiosity about what's happening with storytelling. So I looked up a couple of articles on it that had been referenced. And the first one I looked at was Scientific American back from 2008. And they commented that, you know, storytelling is a sort of universal thing. There are stories that are part of our tradition. They're universal. They're told around the world in various forms by all sorts of different cultures. And a lot of researchers have been looking at stories and the way that they affect us and our behavior over the years to try to understand what is it that's so impactful. Why are we captivated by stories like this? And they said psychologists and neuroscientists have been studying our predilection for storytelling. Why does our brain seem to be wired to enjoy stories? And how do the emotional and cognitive effects of a narrative influence our belief and real-world decisions? So that got me a little more interested. And the next one I looked at was an article from last year in the New York Times called The Brain on Fiction. And it was talking about the neuroscience behind why we read and are so captivated by fiction and stories in books. And what they talked about were brain scans that had been done over the years to start identifying, starting to reveal what's happening with our brains when we're reading words or when we're hearing words versus when we're hearing narratives and various types of stories that have a metaphor or an emotional content to it. And what turns out is that when you're just taking in words, that's really, you're processing that in a language portion of your brain. You've probably heard of areas called like the Broca's area or Wernicke's area, parts of the brain for language processing. And what they discovered with fMRIs is that when you hear or are reading narratives that evoke specific emotions or sensory experiences, that those other parts of the brain are being activated. And so it becomes a much more of an experience, not dissimilar in many ways, at least from the brain's perspective, of actually experiencing that in your life. Okay? So there's a whole bunch of studies on this. I won't go through all the details, but there's quite a few studies that have proved that saying the words coffee or perfume or things like that don't just evoke the cerebral cortex and the language processing areas, but also evoke the sensory parts of the brain and activate those. So one of the reasons, at least, that stories are so compelling to us is because it activates more of our brain and it makes it feel like it's more of an experience. And we learn that way. We share stories. We share those experiences with each other. So a story, if you break it down into its simplest form, is really about cause and effect. And I think we use that every day in our activities. So whether it's your to-do list at work or whether you're getting groceries to take home, you're kind of working a little story in your mind about, okay, I got to do this, and and that'll happen, and then this, and that'll happen, etc. And I think the other important thing for me about stories is that it gives me context and it makes something relevant. So when somebody tells me a story, I get a lot more of the context, and it makes it relevant to me as an experience in addition to just the facts and the content. So that's where I got to, and through a friend, a mutual friend, I got introduced to Dan Yashinsky. And Dan, I'm pleased to say, is quite a well-known Canadian storyteller. He's the author of several books, one of which is called Suddenly They Heard Footsteps, Storytelling for the 21st Century, which he won an award for in 2007. He's also the founder of the Toronto Storytelling Festival. He co-founded the Storytellers School of Toronto, and he performs all over the world at storytelling festivals. He's also been the storyteller in residence at Queen's University, at the Toronto Public Library, the Stop Community Food Centre, Storytelling Toronto, and UNICEF Canada. And in 1999, which was a little while ago, he received the first Jane Jacobs Prize for his work with storytelling in the community. So I'd like to introduce Dan Yashinsky to you, and Dan's going to talk to you about his perspective on storytelling, and then we'll open it up to questions and talk about the things that you guys might want.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to your tribe. I should mention that when Lee contacted me first, I tried to talk my way out of this, not because I wasn't interested in meeting you all, but I wondered if you would be interested in my kind of storytelling. So he said, sure, come on. And because I said, I don't know much about product management, he said, well, that's fine, as long as you know about storytelling. So I know about storytelling. So we'll figure out how useful it is or isn't as we go. And I hope it is useful to you. I was talking to Rod and San earlier, just before, and I really did feel like I had landed in a group of storytellers because they were using words like, okay, this is your vocabulary. I'm reflecting it back to you here, but agile stories. Have you heard that? Put up your hand if you know what an agile story is. That's awesome. An agile story. The image in my mind was, little story dashing around. And okay, you didn't see that, but that's what I see. An agile story. I learned a new word. I'd never heard it my whole life. Pain point. How many of you know what a pain point is? This is awesome. This is a whole, I feel like I'm in a tribe and I'm an anthropologist learning your language. I'm taking notes. The pain point. Could someone tell me what a pain point? I know Rod did a good job, but could you okay, Lee, what's a pain point?
Well, I've got one on my elbow.
No. That's a pain point. Is that, okay, is that when you as a product manager find the longing, the desire in that other person for something they didn't even know they were missing? Is that their pain point?
What kind of pain point is for our customers is they're trying to do X.
They're trying to do
They're
X.
trying to find out how because they can't.
And you walk in and say, here we are.
And they pull out the credit card.
And you've done a good job. And you
said something interesting, though. You said that these people don't already know they have.
Yeah.
A pain point, well, if I didn't know I had it, I wouldn't have a pain. So why did you say that they don't know they have it?
Well,
I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, I was trying to imagine, but pardon me while I move the furniture. That storytellers always move furniture. You need to know that. That's part of the job or something. Okay, so I was imagining, maybe I'm wrong, that there was once a world without BlackBerrys, let's say. No offense to anybody from Rim. Okay, so all of a sudden, here's a BlackBerry. We didn't know we wanted it so desperately, but you found that BlackBerry-lessness in our lives, or iPhone-less, or whatever it may be. So I guess I was imagining that people might not necessarily know that they want it. You were going to make a comment as well.
I think the pain point from my perspective is the pain. If you don't have it, you feel the pain. It's not something that is nice to have.
Yeah. This is good. One more.
I don't belong to this tribe too, so I'm like you.
Okay. We're both taking notes.
Exactly. So I come from support work.
Yeah.
And to me, pain point for the customer
XYZ thing. The thing that stops them from being successful at their business is their pain. A technical definition.
Okay. Well, I will be discovering this in our short time together. He told me we'll only have 3 hours with this. Like a short. Okay, so having said that, you know the story about the rabbi? Rabbi had a student, and the student came to the rabbi one day and asked the rabbi, "What's the meaning of life?" That was the question the student asked. "What's the meaning of life?" And the rabbi slapped the student, just like that, slapped. And the student he said, "Why did you slap me, teacher? Why did you slap me?" And this is what the rabbi said. He said, "How dare you give up such a good question for a mere answer? Answers divide us, but the questions we share bring us together." So, having said that, here's the question that I brought, trying to prepare for meeting you tonight. I thought the most interesting question we could ask ourselves together, from my world of storytelling and your understanding of stories, agile stories, is the question of listening. In other words, what are people listening for? What are people hearing in what we are saying? And so if it's all right with you, and if it's all right with Lee, who asked me to come out tonight, maybe we can look at storytelling from the perspective of the listener. Seems to me that's what's... And I'll just go back to what you were saying earlier. Often in business, people are using the word storytelling to mean being persuasive. As if stories help you sell better. There's no problem. You have to sell, make a living. I sell stories. That's what I do for a living. I persuade schools and festivals to hire me so I can tell stories. That's my product. Okay? I tell folk tales. Yesterday I told folk tales at Bishop Strawn's school. Today I told folk tales at the Stop Community Food Center. That's my living, okay? So that's what I have to do. But I'm not sure that they really do help you be more persuasive. I'm not sure about that. And that's one of the things that you often hear. Storytelling will help you be better at selling or better at persuading customers or whatever. Not sure about that. But I am sure that we can learn by thinking about the listening side of it. So I'm just going to give you a couple little stories about listening to stories. Right? So the first one. Oh, and by the way, speaking of product, I'll get to the story. I have a friend in Silicon Valley who I went to high school with, and I even went to jail with. Here, you brought, I should have warned him, not only a high school dropout, I have a few books on that, a high school dropout, but also I was in jail for 2 nights and 1 day in Santa Barbara during a political protest, so I got arrested for jail. So my buddy Mark was in jail with me. He then went on to become a hardware designer in Silicon Valley. And I asked him, "Mark, what do you actually do?" Okay, I'm going to read you his answer. "I write behavioral models for the high-speed memory interface pads that perform the final SerDes function for the GDDR5 drams that compose the frame buffer." And I'll bet half the people in this room know exactly what it is.
That's the scary part.
And I said, "Okay, Mark, what do you do? What do you really, really do?" He said, "Oh, okay. What I really do, I enable teenage boys to kill more zombies." And that's exactly what the interface does for the games that the teenagers. So, I was thinking, that's his. If he had to say it in plain old prose, that's what he does. But. So it's funny how we use language in these different ways. Oh, and speaking of listening, I don't know if you're fans of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but here let's start off this talk about listening with this quote from The Hitchhiker's Guide. "You know," said Arthur, "it's at times like this when I'm trapped in a Vulcan airlock with a man from Betelgeuse." How do you say that, Star? Betelgeuse? Betelgeuse? Help me? Okay. "And about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young." "Why? What did she tell you?" "I don't know. I didn't listen." So that's it. So that's just to remember. So about listening. So my partner was telling our son a bedtime story many, many years ago. He was 3 years old at the time. And he's 25 now. But anyway, he hated going to sleep. He just hated going to sleep. He didn't like to sleep. So one night, she decided to try to put him to sleep by telling a very boring story in a very low voice and very monotonously. And the story she made up on the spot went something like this. She said, in the barnyard, all the animals were getting very sleepy. The chickens were getting sleepy. The cows were getting sleepy. The piggies were getting sleepy. And she went on and on and on and on and on. And finally, he looked up from the pillow and he said to her, suddenly they heard footsteps. So the story had to get very exciting and he didn't go to sleep. So what was he listening for in that so-called story she was trying to use to get him to go to sleep? What's that moment when the footsteps come to the barnyard? That moment of transformation. And I wanted to mention that because, in a way, it goes back to what Lee had said about the research. Seems to me we are hardwired to listen, not just for the nice words, but for the underlying story. Even at 3 years old, he knew that all this stuff about the animals, that wasn't a story. It became a story at the moment when a transformation became possible. Just saying it as I understand that experience. So whenever you're working with story, it seems to me there's a moment in that story when something is different afterwards. So who knows what the footsteps were? I don't know. But there's a footstep coming towards you in a story. I'll give you one other example. Actually, I have two more examples, and then we'll open it up and see what your own experiences are. I was telling stories at a place called the Inner City Angels. And it's a downtown arts center. It used to be behind Eaton Center, right next to the church that's there. Wasn't it Holy Trinity or Little Trinity? Anyway, yeah. So anyway, I was telling stories to these kids who had come from a Catholic school near St. Lawrence Market. And I was up in the library up on the top floor. So these kids had come up from the lunchroom. They came up to hear the storytelling. So here they came up the stairs. But this was not a very respectful group of kids. They came in, they were grade 5, so they were a little bit restless, and they were at the art center, and they walked in with a little bit of an attitude. And they, kind of like you guys did. No. Yeah, he kind of swaggered in. And one boy, I still remember, was blowing a bubble, big pink bubble gum, and he blew it at me as if to say, I'm a tough guy. I blow bubbles at school. And anyway, they came in. And there they sat down. And I was trying to think, what kind of story should I tell this group? I was think about it. I finally decided to tell them a ghost story. It was around Halloween. So I told them this story. Some of you probably know it. I'll give you the express version. There was a man who wanted to get married, which is not the scary part. They thought that was the scary part. Anyway. And he searched the world to find a bride. He finally found a woman, and she had a right arm made of solid gold. And he said, would you marry me? I love you so much. So she agreed, and they were married. But she got sick, and nobody knew why she was getting sick. Until one day, she said to her husband, if I die, I want you to bury me with my golden arm. He said, yes, I promise. Not long afterwards, she died. Kept his promise. She was buried with the golden arm. He came to the grave. He's all in black. He's crying. And he came back at midnight that same night with a shovel. And he dug up the grave, opened the coffin, took the golden arm off the body, went home, put it under his pillow to keep it safe. Kept the golden arm. That night he had a nice dream. He dreamt he was rich. And the next night he was rich. Golden dreams. But after a lot of nights of golden dreams, he had a nightmare. He was back at the grave. He was back at the grave, and he looked down, and the grave was open. The coffin lid open. And when he in his bedroom, and there was his wife at the end of the bed, standing there. What was left of her? She stood there at the end of the bed. He pulled up his blankets. He was so scared, and he said, What has become of your lovely hair? And she said, all withered and wasted away. And he said, what has become of your cheeks so fair? She said, all withered and wasted away. And what has become of your lovely eyes? She said, all withered and wasted away. And what has become of your ruby red lips? She said again, all withered and wasted. And then she started to lean over with her left arm towards him. Pull up the blankets, pull up the blankets. By the way, it's true. You ever get scared at night, you always pull up your blankets. It's kind of, I was in an earthquake once in Santa Barbara, and I pulled up my blankets. I don't know. So I pulled up my blankets. So this man, he pulled up his blankets, and she was reaching over the bed towards him. And he said, with his last few, he said, what has become of your golden arm? And as she leaned over the bed towards him, she said, you have it. Sorry about that. You know the story goes, okay? I'm sorry. That's how the story goes. It's an old story. It's a well-known story. I should have warned you. But after,
That's okay.
Well, after I told that to the kids, it was very satisfying because, of course, they all jumped. That was nice. That was the point. The boys' bubble burst. That was fun. But there was one girl who didn't jump. This is really why I'm telling you this. She stood there at the end of the session. She just stood there holding something around her neck. And I came up to her afterwards and I said, yeah, did you like this story? She said, yes, I did. But when you told that last one, I didn't jump. She was quite proud of herself. I said, yes, I noticed that. Why? She said, because when I knew it was going to be scary, I held the Blessed Virgin Mary. And she had an amulet on her neck, and she said, you should get one. So I said, well, I'm not sure I should. I'm Jewish. She said, that's okay. Get a Jewish one. So she's my second example of listening. And what she knew is, as I think about it afterwards, of course, she had a lot of wisdom for a 10-year-old girl. And part of her wisdom was to know that when things are getting scary, you have to hold on to something. Something that will give you guidance, comfort, understanding, whatever it may be, courage. I mean, that was just the golden arm. And I often think about how we live in this world now that is unprecedented. We are going through things now as the human race that no other generation has ever faced, has ever gone through. We are the only people in the history of the human race who are going through some of these things that we are now. A lot of it has to do with technology. I suppose a lot of it has to do with the global risks that you can read about every day of the day. Point is, we live in very uncertain times. So what do you hold on to? What do you hold on to? And in the case of the little girl, it was the Blessed Virgin Mary. In the case of me as a professional storyteller, it's the idea that a head full of stories will help you at least understand what choices we have to make as we go through our daily lives. For everybody, it'll be something different, perhaps. And it will make a connection, I hope, to your work as well through all of this. But what do you hold on to? That's one of the questions I got from that story. And the third example, also from my own life experience, I was a camp counselor at a place called Bolton Camp. And I'm just going to give you one little experience I had there because I learned, again, something about listening. Anybody here ever been a counselor? You ever worked at a camp? You know what it's like to be around the campfire? Okay, so Bolton Camp was a camp for the very poorest kids of the city. And I had just moved to Canada from Santa Barbara, California. I went to university in Santa Barbara. Didn't know what I wanted to do with my life at all. Really didn't. Ended up working at Bolton Camp. And here are my little boys. I had 8-year-old boys in my cabin. And these were very wild children, I have to say. These kids were pretty wild. And I had never worked with children in my whole life. And here I was. Yes, I'd been through the 60s, and I'd been political protest. I studied Chaucer at university. And all of that never prepared me for my 8-year-old boys. So I had to figure out a way how to keep them calm, how to keep them under control, which was a challenge. And then I noticed that every night, whenever we built the fire, we took the kids up, they sat around in a circle, the counselor would tell stories. And that's when my boys became the world's greatest listeners. Now, I mean, I wish I could tell you the stories were nice, beautiful stories. In fact, they weren't. They were the summer camp stories, rather like the Golden Arm. At Bolton Camp, they told stories about Old Man Bolton, the local axe murderer. Anyway, we probably shouldn't have been telling them, but we did. And my little 8-year-olds are listening to these horrible stories. And then the story would end, and the counselor would say, "So, boys, he's never been found. But some people say he's still out there. Have a nice evening, everybody. Sleep well." Yeah. Anyway, I decided to learn a story myself. And not one of the horror stories. I decided to learn a fairy tale. A really beautiful fairy tale. This is my first time telling a story. And I got a collection of Russian fairy tales, and I learned a beautiful story about the firebird. You know those stories? The firebird is a woman in the shape of a beautiful bird with fiery wings, firebird. So I learned the story. And one night I decided to tell my story. This is my world debut performance. Here I had my 8-year-old boys in their bunks, including Frankie. Now, Frankie was a real little hellion. This kid, I often used to wonder what it became of him after camp, because he had the charisma to either be at Parliament or Kingston Penitentiary. Because he was one of those really strong personalities, but he could have gone either way. Judging from his behavior at 8 years old, he's probably at Kingston Penitentiary. But anyway, God forbid that. So here he was. All the kids are in their bunks. They're eating their snack, and I'm telling this beautiful story. At least I tried to. And I began the story, and I said, "Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen, and they had 3 sons. And Frankie, on his bunk, went like this. I was a brand new storyteller. I was young. I was about 22. And I got really mad that kid had interrupted my beautiful story that I had learned. This was my world premiere. But I thought to myself, I better ignore the misbehavior. He'll probably get over it. So I continued. I said, "Yeah, the king went blind. And he called his 3 sons to him, and he said, 'My sons, you must go on a quest to find a cure for your old father's blindness.' And the first 2 princes rode off on their quest. But the 3rd prince looked at his father, the king, opened his mouth, and he said," so Frankie did it again. Frankie's up there. I'm starting to really get mad now, because this is such a beautiful story. He's up there. All the other kids, "Hey, hey, hey, hey." If you've ever tried to work with kids, I don't know what it's like being product managers, but you probably don't face that with your customers. You try to tell them about this wonderful new internet, and they go, I'm sure not. But so then I thought to myself, that's it. I'm sick of this misbehavior. And I walked up to my little 8-year-old boy. He was on the upper bunk, so I was standing, and I kind of looked right into his eye, and I said, "Frankie, listen, I'm not from Detroit originally, so I said, you do that one more time, and I'm going to kick you out. Do you understand?" Okay, look, everybody, you never say to a kid like Frankie, "If you do this one more time." What was I thinking? So I get back to the story. The 3rd prince said, "Daddy, I don't want to go on the quest right now. I'm going to go for a nap." If you guys know your old-time stories, your traditional stories, the real hero almost always goes for a nap. He doesn't go off on the quest. He's always, "I don't have to." It's just kind of lazy. He went for a nap under his favorite apple tree in the garden. He went to sleep. He had a dream. And in his dream, he heard a voice. Voice said, Frankie did it one more time. And I lost it. And I'm not proud of this, but it's a true story. And I went over to his bunk, and I dragged him out in his pajamas, opened the door, and threw him out into the night. locked the door. And then I kept telling the story, and the other boys listened really well. But Frankie kept pounding on the door saying, "Old man Bolton's going to chop me up with his axe." I'm thinking, good, I don't care. So I told the story. And this is really why I wanted to mention it to you, because, at the end of the story he came in, but he never heard that story. And many, many years later, I thought a lot about that. And I guess I understood something about the story and about what he was listening for. Frankie was the hero of that story. All the old stories, all the folk tales and fairy tales in the world, in every country, tell us that it's the kid who's always in trouble, who has what we would call now ADD, who has 5 social workers and 2 psychiatric nurses following him around in school, like Frankie. The kid who's in the office every day, that kid, according to the old stories, is the one who could become transformed to a leader, to a king, if somebody recognizes that in them. So what he was trying to say to me was, gee, Mr. Storyteller, those are pretty words you're saying. But did you know you're telling my story? I didn't know that at the time. So he never even got to hear the story that was about him. That makes sense what I'm saying? All the stories are about that kid, the one who no one thinks will succeed, but finally does if one person recognizes their qualities. Now, having said that, and this is where I wanted to bring the point back to this group here, as I understand storytelling now, the listener is the hero of your story. In some very deep and mysterious way, the listener is the hero of the story. And what does that mean? When you're telling your story, it means you must give them a story worthy of their listening. So that's why earlier I'd said I'm not 100% sure storytelling is, yes, it can be used to persuade, but there's something even bigger involved when you're using stories in your work, certainly in my work as a professional storyteller, but even in yours, because you are using story, I would think. You're using stories hopefully as agile as possible. You want your stories to connect and to be meaningful to the people you're telling to. But it's more than just persuading them that this is a useful thing to them or that it will solve the pain point they perhaps knew they had, or maybe you didn't even realize until you started to tell them about what you could bring to them. Maybe there's another role for stories in our lives, which is to open up the possibilities, not only in a technical sense, but in a human sense, for who they could be. I'm just saying, when you're coming into this world of storytelling, and I know some of you are already very much in it, I guess that's the question that I would pose to all of us. But back to the beginning, the answers divide, but the questions are what bring us together, and that's an important question. When you're going out as product managers, I'll quit with one last little story, then we can open this up. But when you're going out as product managers, how would you design your story if you truly believed that my listener is the hero of this story? I'm not saying you're going to make it a big heroic story. This product and service will, do everything that you've longed for in your life. No. But it does mean that there's another level of connection, perhaps, than just, you need this. I don't know enough about your world to know exactly how you frame your own storytelling, but that's a little bit of how I deal with mine. So I'm just going to end with one more little Jewish story about yet another rabbi. Maybe you know this story already. There was a rabbi who was known for being a very good storyteller. And what made his stories so good was that he always told the right story at the right moment. We've all been at parties where we were told the wrong story at the wrong moment and at length. Yeah. Okay, so no. He always told the right story at the right moment. If people were too happy, he found a story to sober them up a bit. If they were too sad, his story. So he had a student. And the student said to him one day, "Teacher, please, I've been with you all these years, and I love your stories, but even more, I love the way you tell the right story at the right moment, and I would like to learn how you do it." He said,
could you teach me your skill? Teach me your technique so I can learn how to. So the rabbi looked at the student, and you guys all know what he was, and he said, well, that reminds me of a story. What else did he say? He said, there was a young man who wanted to become a sharpshooter. And so he went to the Academy of Sharpshooting, and he became a great sharpshooter. He became an Olympic-level sharpshooter. He was very, very good. He knew all the skills of sharpshooting, all the techniques. He was really good, top level. And he was riding home to show his parents what he had learned. He's coming through a village, and he's coming along, and it's a poor village too, not a fancy, rich village, a poor little village. On the side of the road was a barn. And on the side of the barn were 100 targets. And in the dead center of each target, somebody had shot a perfect bullseye. Now, this young man, he was good. He was very good. He was great. He knew all the skills of sharpshooting. But even he could not possibly shoot 100 perfect bullseyes. Possibly. So he stopped his horse and he looked around this little village and he thought to himself, how could the world's greatest sharpshooter live in this pokey little village? But there was the evidence. So he called out and he said, I would like to meet the world's greatest sharpshooter who lives here, please. I'd like to meet that master so I can learn from that person. So a little girl came across the street, and she looked up at this great young sharpshooter, and she said, I did it. And she looked up at him, and he looked at this girl and said, excuse me, little girl, no teasing. I want to meet the great, great sharpshooter who can shoot 100 perfect bullseyes. She said, I did it. She said, that's what I did that. He gets off his horse. He looks at the little girl. He said, then in that case, I would like to learn from you. Teach me the technique, the skill for shooting 100 perfect bullseyes. And the little girl said to him, all right, but maybe I should explain first. You see, she said, I don't draw the target first. First I shoot, and afterwards I draw the target. And the rabbi said, and that's exactly the way it is for me. He said, I know stories. He said, I read stories. I listen to people's stories. I invent stories. I go to gatherings of product managers and I listen to their stories. I try to fill my head with stories. And when you go through life with a head full of good stories, it's never hard to find a moment to put the story around. And that was how he explained the ability to tell the right story at the right time. So this is one of those big discussions, but I think maybe I'll leave it over to Lee and to the group that, as you wish to continue, about maybe we can find some common ground between the kind of stories that I'm interested in, mostly traditional stories, of course, and the kind of stories you do as product managers. And let's see if there's time to continue the talk. So
let me start by asking more about listening.
Okay. Yeah.
I think as you've sort of gathered already, one of the key parts of a product manager's role is to listen to customers and really seek out their business challenge or their business problem, their pain points, whatever that might be. And so good product managers do spend time listening. I'm not sure that we think of those as stories from our customers, but we could, certainly. And there's, in those conversations, there's also, so the product manager is listening, but the product manager is also encouraging and telling stories to get the customer to open up and talk about that. Could you talk about stories where there are two people engaged in a conversation telling the story?
Can someone help me out here? I mean, aren't almost all conversations story-based anyway? When someone tells, I need an example. Could you give us an example, Lee? Okay, here, I'm a customer. Come and tell me a story about something, or come and listen to my. Let's do this. Let's do this so I can really understand. Let's give an example here. Has anybody here ever been in that situation where you needed to elicit the story from the customer in such a way that you could respond with your own? Does that make sense? Is that what you're asking about?
Exactly.
A dialogue, a story-based dialogue that you yourselves have had. Can you give us an example?
everybody hear? Do you want to stand, or can you hear? Okay.
Sure. On Friday, meeting with one customer, training them to start using our software, and they were telling us the stories of how they work with their clients.
Yeah.
They give us the example stories. So we walk in. This is our project. That's our deliverables. Now, please help us. How can we use your product? How can we use it to help our customers?
Okay.
So they tell us the action stories. We have a workshop, and we want to promote this.
So there's a good example. So their stories are about what they're looking for,
Yeah.
and the problems that they're having because they don't have this,
Yeah.
and you're able to respond.
So, yes. Yeah. So they say. So here's the story. They say, okay, we have a workshop in downtown. We want to promote this workshop. We have trainers. We have people. They don't know how to use social media. Help us. We have a community manager, but we want to use it. So please help us with this.
Right.
And then we train it based on their stories.
Yeah.
That,
Sounds like they do it all the time and every day.
So the thing I think one of the challenges that I've run into is there are occasions when you are talking to a customer that you want to get some understanding of their business, and you'll ask them a question, something like, "Tell me about your business," or "What are your challenges?" and you'll get a blank stare, or need to loosen them up in order to get them to talk about it. And I'm thinking that a story is one of the ways to connect with somebody.
A story to do with the product you're bringing to their attention, or just a story about
their business.
Okay.
We're just trying to bridge the gap to that.
Yeah. Michael? Yeah.
So, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
I'm in sales.
Yeah.
I don't do product management. Right? So that is exactly my job. Is to take someone I don't know and get them to tell me their stories.
Right.
Okay. A good example, and I'll tell you a story, is I was telling Gabriel at the back here about this earlier on. Recently, I phoned a company out of Vancouver, and I said, "I know you're the distributor for this system from this company in the U.S. Way back, me and a partner had a company that went to satellite business, blah blah blah. We were involved with this technology, on and on and on, and things didn't work out. The satellite industry crashed. We lost our $1 million to the industry Canada. Blah blah blah. And I got him to talk a little bit about it. What does he do? What's his relationship with this company and so on. And after a while, at the end of my story, he was really open to talking. And it's the same effect that, in a way, that marketing would have, where I pick up the phone and someone calls me saying they have a problem, they want to talk and see if I can solve it. Whereas from sales, you're trying to reach out, grab that person's attention, turn the tables, and now that relationship's there, they're open. It's as though they called me. So that's how I use it.
I think in your case too, the story isn't that it's about persuading them.
No.
It's about expressing a common relationship that you both have with that business and that product or that experience.
Yeah.
I mean, stories in a way come out of a relationship, right?
It's building that relationship and then
They express the relationship rather than set it up. I don't know. Thank you for that example.
Another common technique that sales and marketing terms produce is providing success stories, right? So here's a story of a customer who had this problem, and this is what their pain points were, and this is how they got the solution. This is what they did with it. Yeah. And I guess the purpose of that is to put it in content, or perhaps there's commonality between the listener and the subject of the success story, that they have some similar issue that they can relate to the solution.
Presumably, all of you are in the business of telling successful stories. I mean, stories about success, because otherwise, who would be buying all this stuff out there, right? So that's the foundation. Is that yes, this is a good thing. It works. It will work for you. Yeah.
One just added to that story is I wouldn't be able to have those conversations if I didn't entertain someone.
If you didn't
Entertain.
Yeah.
Oh yes,
That's the biggest part of it.
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, even a really boring conversation about some mechanism, but if if that guy uses it all the time, he's entertained by that call.
Yeah, no, good
Son
point.
of a big shit.
Yeah, yeah. You don't want to.
I don't really know if I have a question here, but it's interesting. I was listening to this audio book on the way down here, and they talked a bit about public speaking,
Right.
and they were talking about, I mean, apart from starting with the end, the conclusion at the beginning with a real punch,
Yeah.
they talked about different techniques, and one could be using a well-known quote, and they talked about a story, where you might want to relate a story to make a point.
Yeah.
So I know we've been talking about stories. I mean, a story could be any conversation, but how about an actual story in the traditional sense? How can we use that, I guess, in product management or general to try and succeed at whatever it is that we're trying to achieve?
That's a good question. That's another hour of discussion. But I'll give you a miniature answer to that, or my own response anyway. How many of you grew up in here, I'm going to be a little bit personal here. How many of you grew up in a family where your parents or step-parents or grandparents always had a proverb or a saying that they liked to use when you were going through whatever experience it may be? Can we give a couple of examples? Yeah, Shan? In any language that, but what was this proverb or saying that's still in your head now as an adult?
Well, my grandfather tended to use something that said something to the effect of anything in the extreme is not good. So,
No, everything in moderation, nothing.
everything in moderation.
Everything in moderation. When would he say that to you?
Different times, whether it's anything to do with, studying too much, playing too much, eating too much.
So he would say everything in moderation. Another example?
Go tell it on the mountain.
Go tell. And when would who would say that to you?
My father, constantly. And I find that I actually use that now quite often.
And what would the context be of?
Well, it was usually in a negative context, like if I was complaining about something.
Go tell it
on the mountain. That's funny.
Go tell it on the mountain. In other words, don't bother me with this complaint. Yeah, one more.
I used to maybe gripe at times.
Yeah.
This was an Italian saying, but if I translate it in English,
Say it in Italian first, though.
Posso mia nonna aveva 4 ruote. So, if my grandmother had 4 wheels,
she'd be a bus.
Yeah. Whatever. Like, it would just, life would just be so much easier, right?
Has anybody heard that before? Yeah. In other words, if you're complaining, if only, yeah, well, if my grandma had 4 wheels, she'd be a bus. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, and I'll come to the point that I wanted to raise here in response to your question, but just give us a couple. Okay, I'll give you one example myself. So I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. My father was a used car dealer the whole time I was growing up. And he then went to night school and studied French. And then he sold his used car lot and became a French professor. And at the University of Toronto. My parents moved here many years before I did. So, but all the time I was growing up, we always have this expression in my family, which is, get out of the car. Get out of the car. So this is Detroit in the 50s. And he had a man working for him who was an African-American man named Jerry Morgan. And Jerry was always getting pulled over by the police. See, Detroit has police. The police would pull him over, and they would say, get out of the car. That's what they said. Racist and rude, but that's what they said. But he took this expression, and he became his life motto. And anything that happened to Jerry would be, get out of the car. Get out of the car. Even if it was, if a girlfriend is new, get out of the car, he's happy. But if something bad happened, get out of the car. So that became a family proverb. And my sons say it now. That's how. One more quick example. Anybody else have an example from parents, grandparents, step-parents? What did you grow up with?
If you were to translate, it sounds like if you rush too fast, you're gonna make people laugh around you. Right?
If you rush too fast, you will.
If you make it too fast, if you rush it way too fast than you should, then everyone else will laugh around you because you're gonna fail.
They're laughing because you're trying to get to it too fast.
Too fast and faster than you should.
Okay. Well, we're almost to the point of the point I wanted to raise. But let's just get a couple more examples. These are all very good examples. Yeah.
One of my teachers used to say, if you got something that needs to be done, give it to a busy person.
want something done, give it to a busy person. That's an interesting. I mean, it's almost like a dilemma there, but the point is they're already organized enough to be able to do it. Is that right? Nobody else will have time to do it. You have to think about that. Give it to a busy person. That makes sense, I guess. Okay, well, we're very close to this. Maybe one more good expression. Yeah?
There's actually a product management expression from Pragmatic, and we sort of touched on this. They say if there's an actor, the heat, nothing important happens in the office.
Huh. Did you guys hear that? Mejito. Have you heard that before? Okay, who else is with that company?
Well, last time is that they make a framework for product management. So
yeah.
Depending on which class you're in,
nothing important happens in the office.
Like lean startup, get out of the
Get out. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, that's good. Well, okay, I think I can sort of bring this back to what you had asked about, which is how do you introduce the language of story? I know when Charles mentioned this whole idea of speaking the language of story, that vocabulary of the imagination. How do you introduce it into what could otherwise be a pretty conventional discussion about a product, a need, a business, whatever they're looking for? And it seems to me that even these little proverbs and sayings that you grew up with have power. You're already speaking the language of story. So, for example, I can imagine being in a conversation with someone and saying something like, "What did you do? You know, if you want something done, give it to a busy person." I can imagine there being a context for that. Or you had another one that I thought would be apt. What was that one you just said?
The last one.
Yeah.
Oh,
nothing but, yeah, okay, yeah, that's another one. But then some of the little things we've just heard, and the ones that you even grew up with. There's no reason you couldn't be personal in these relationships with people, or customers, or coders, or whoever you're dealing with. There's no reason you can't introduce that level into the conversation. And here's why it is, I think, a good thing to do if it fits, your own personality. They also had a parent, a grandparent, a step-parent, or somebody in their family who told them proverbs. And the minute you change that conversation by bringing in that one little element of the imagination, of the metaphor, whatever it may be, you've opened up a new way of talking with them about whatever it may be, but certainly about the product. Does that make sense? It seems to me that can happen very quickly. I wanted to just read you a couple of proverbs too that I brought. I'm a proverb collector. I like them a lot. This is from Southern Ontario. Never say "whoa" in a mud hole. Seems like that's a useful proverb if in the right context. And especially if you're dealing with a customer who's in a mud hole, right? Well, it's not the time to say "whoa." Let's find a solution for you. And never say "whoa" in a mud hole. Never play an ace when a two will do. Does that make sense too? I mean, you don't have to think of any possible connections to your work, but that's a poker saying. Never play an ace when a two will do. What does it mean? Don't waste your resources. Choose carefully. Find the right way to do it, so you're not, clobbering them with never. Another one. Well, this is just an old Jewish proverb that says, "The shortest distance between a human being and the truth is a story." And if you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, walk with friends. And that's a proverb from West Africa. That's a beautiful proverb, by the way. So, here's another one. That's another one from my background. You can't dance at two weddings with one tuchus. Okay. So that could be useful, right? If someone's saying, well, we're trying to do these two projects, we can't figure out, you can't dance at two weddings with one tuchus, so let's make a decision about which one is the most important. And then we'll give it to a busy person. Because if your grandma had wheels, But the point is, that is a language that perhaps we used to speak more in the not-so-distant past. And there's no reason that language of story couldn't be made alive again in your own work. It's certainly alive in your homes. Anybody here who grew up, you hear this stuff as a kid. You say it to your own kids now. I mean, somebody was saying, How many of you say stuff now that you heard as a kid? You can't believe you're saying the same old proverbs. Okay, one last example of something you yourself, grew up with and now you still say it.
Well, the worst one, because it doesn't fly anymore, is when my kids ask me, why do I have to do that? Because I said so.
Yeah, good luck with that nowadays. Because I said so. Yeah. Yeah.
So what happened to the story with the three princes? Is that actually there's third ending there?
Someone's paying attention. He was listening.
Or was that just used as a
It is it's a beautiful story. It's half an hour long. The third prince gets up. It's called the Firebird. You can find many versions all around the world. Many of you Russian background? Yeah, you come from Russia. Beautiful story. He goes off on a quest. He has many dangers and many adventures. The two older princes are total, losers, so they don't do anything. But he brings back the beautiful Firebird, and she cures his blind father. And the story ends by saying, as they found their heart's desire, or in your vocabulary, as they found their pain point, as they found their heart's desire, may you find yours. It's a beautiful story. If you have kids or you're around kids, find a version and read it out loud or tell it. Yeah, Charles?
If I can ask a question, which I'm not sure exactly what the answer is to this, but I'd love to hear either your opinion or if anybody else has an idea. So as you're talking, I'm in my mind, I'm thinking about my own product and my launch and stuff, and I'm starting to think, okay, I've got waves of different training where I'm training a lot of salespeople, and I'm thinking, okay, I've got another wave coming up and slightly different angle, different kind of approach on this. That's great. And I'm starting to say, you know what? I kind of like the approach that you were talking about. In other words, maybe start off with a story, and then I'd open up the training session by giving an allegorical story. Now, of course, the immediate reaction is to say, okay, here's what my product does, and I'll tell a story that really, really parallels this nicely. But that's very simplistic. So I'm sitting back thinking, how could I come up with something or find a story or something which isn't too patronizing, not too simple, it doesn't pick up on the little pigs or those type of stories which everybody knows and is overplayed. Any recommendations? Because again, I think that could be a very powerful tool to say, you start off with a little story, and even if you're in front of a customer, to say, here's a little story. Let me tell you a little story about blah, blah, blah. And I tell a little allegorical story, and then afterwards, it's got to be subtle, because some of your stories have been fairly subtle. But afterwards, you kind of get on that trend and say, oh yeah, I think I know what he means.
May I? You were going to say this one?
Well, I was going to say that you take a different stance to that, in the sense that we do that in our products example. This is more so kind of a complex product that we have. But what we do is we try and put ourselves in the customer's shoes, and because we're showing them a demonstration of the software using different types of test cases or data sets, we then develop a story around that and say, okay, if it's a retail company and it's a shoe store and they'd like to do X, Y, and Z, we start and we set up the stage with that, and then we kind of walk through an entire scenario using that. Sometimes we may not necessarily have a data set that belongs to that particular industry, but then when they come and start asking us questions, what about X, what about Y, and what about Z, then we try and take sort of stories, which are examples of other use cases that customers have asked us about, or clients have asked us about. We kind of
Let me back up though. I think Charles is asking that is a focused and functional approach to using stories in your work. But in fact, your question is, how do you bring in that overall language of metaphor? I think you used allegorical. I would think of that as traditional stories or folk and fairy tale. That whole world of stories that have been passed on and passed on and passed on because they have something to teach. And I just wanted to say two things about that. Is one, the story itself might not be so directly functional in terms of persuading your sales staff that this is a good approach or that is a good approach. But it will do at least a couple of things. A, it might make them laugh if it's the well-chosen story. And B, it opens up another way of talking and imagining. And I should give you just a couple of little examples. Okay?
And frankly, it will be memorable. That's
Yeah,
one of
it's
the things I'm
memorable.
always looking for is how do I make this memorable?
Can I
tie them to it?
Can I end with just a couple of little stories? Do we have time?
Please,
Are you going to be at time? Yeah. You know, they say engineers have watches, but storytellers have time. Now, I would think a lot of people in this room are playing a leadership role in whatever company, be it your startup or a big corporation. Is that accurate? You bring people together, you have to convince them, you have to teach them, you train. So there was the king once who invited the whole village to the feast. Everybody was invited. And the king said, it's free, just come to the feast. But one little thing I'd ask is that you bring a calabash of palm wine. You guys know that a calabash is a dried gourd, carries stuff. So bring palm wine, it's an African story. Bring a calabash of palm wine to the big jar in the middle of the village. Everybody puts a little bit of palm wine in, be a feast, it'll be wonderful. But there was one man who said to his wife, I don't have any palm wine, but I really want to go to the feast. And she said, well, just go to the neighbor, buy a little bit of extra. You put it in your calabash. You don't even have to bring much. The king just said, a little palm wine is enough. So he says, all right, no, I have a better idea. He says, I'll put water in my calabash. When I come to the big jar in the middle of the village, I'll put the water in it. Nobody will notice the difference. Big calabash, big jar full of palm wine. So that's what he did. He came with his calabash of water. He came to the big feast. There was a big jar in the middle of the village, and he emptied. Everybody was coming up, emptying. The feast began. And the servant brought bowls of palm wine to everybody who had come to the village for the great feast. And the king came out of it. And the servant said, lift your bowls. Honor to the king. And everybody lifted their bowls. And this man, he lifted his bowl and he took a sip. And he put it down. And he looked around and everybody in the village was looking sideways and up and down. Honor to the king. He sipped again. Didn't taste like palm wine. What did it taste like? How was that possible? Everybody brought water. Nobody brought palm wine. Everybody thought somebody else will bring the palm wine. And ever since then, they have a proverb. And this goes back to Proverbs. It says, if water is all you bring to the feast, water is all you'll have to drink. Now, a story like that's a folk tale from West Africa. Does it serve a particular use? Is it persuasive? Not really. It just is a story. But within that story, if you're leading a group, guaranteed it now gives you a vocabulary of communal effort that throughout that workshop, you can say to people, okay, wait a minute, are you bringing the palm wine or are you bringing the water? You follow me? So that's the language of story. So that would be one little example. Yeah. Is that good for you?
Actually, frankly, your story is brilliant because it gives me an idea of what I can do with my sales book. Honestly,
here's a bowl of water.
The reason I like your story is effectively the message that story can convey is also that what you're bringing into this training session is what you're going to be getting out of it.
Right.
And there you go. I'll be able to tell by your numbers.
There you go. That's exactly right. And yet you won't ever have to say that. You can just tell the story.
That's right.
That's the nice thing about stories. You don't have to. Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Since you study this so much, how has storytelling changed in the 21st century as opposed to last century or centuries ago? What if I go in to tell people stories? What's different? How does it affect culture?
Yeah. Well, that's a big question again. A big one. I'll give you the very, very express answer. I got interested in it back in the 70s. And about the same time, all around the world, there was the beginning of this movement to bring storytelling back in a way to rediscover it. So, for example, this festival, I started it in 1979, and it's still going. I brought flyers. It's called the Toronto Storytelling Festival, 35 years later. And we're bringing storytellers from all around the world to Toronto. And we're over at Regent Park working with the local community to tell stories as well. All around the world, I'm going to Austria, storytelling in many, many places. So at about the same time around the world, there was this idea that it's important to bring back oral storytelling, not reading aloud, oral storytelling. And it's a bit of a mystery why, in the late 20th century, of all times in human history, this art has been rediscovered. In some parts of the world, it was never lost. Certainly, if you go up north, you'll still find First Nations that remember. If you go out to the east coast of Newfoundland, they never lost their stories. Or go to Ireland, you know, some cultures, it's strong in Arabic culture still. People will communicate their stories. Every Chinese person will tell you Monkey King stories, and so these stories are still alive. Go to the West Indies, people tell Anansi stories, and so on. But as a movement, it did start again as a kind of a rediscovery of it. So how's it different now than, I guess in the sense that we're trying to figure it out now. What does it mean to be storytellers in the 21st century? What's the, and I'm saying not facetiously, but what's the pain point that this movement has addressed? Was there a lack of storytelling in the 20th century? All of a sudden people said, yeah, there was. And in the sense that there was perhaps a lack of people gathering and listening and speaking and remembering their stories in their heads. That's part of storytelling. You have it in your head, right? That makes sense. I did write a book called Suddenly They Heard Footsteps. I stole the title from my kid. But it kind of explores that idea. Why has it come back nowadays? I know you guys have to head up pretty soon. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, kind of, I think everything just kind of came together through this whole discussion where we started out talking about how there's biological, some biological evidence around storytelling, how that maybe initiates more emotion, how we just had the story with the wine and the water, how you can use that in one of your meetings. So I'm thinking, well, if you can relate at another level and communicate at that other level, then it's going to become memorable. It's going to become maybe a lot more effective. So I think it just kind of all tied together.
So you'll have to keep me posted. I admire the work you're doing. I'm just even our ahead of time conversation with Rod and Sam was an eye opener to me. Yeah.
I was going to say, you're talking about Proverbs, and my grandfather was big about truckers talk to shippers very well. So adopting the language of the person that you're talking to. But one of his sayings that it's all the time for me, and I really made sense of it as an adult, was it's never about you. Okay? It's maybe it's almost never about you. And I want to thank you because tonight you reminded me of a mentor of mine who, when dealing with PowerPoints, we all deal with these horrible PowerPoint presentations, right? It's very strict with the number of slides you can have and the type of presentation you can have. And his number one rule is always make the person presenting to you the hero of the story.
Really?
Quote. It's absolutely a quote for him. They are always the hero of the story.
That's right. Frankie.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a nice way to bring the night. What goes around comes around. So thanks for mentioning that.
Cool. Beautiful. Dan, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
It's been a great time.
The TPMA would like to thank its sponsors: 280 Group, Macadamian, One Desk, Pragmatic Marketing, and Wild Apricot. Our podcast music is influenced by Probos. Available at indiefeed.com. Digital voices by iSpeech.org and neospeech.com. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to join us again next month for another exciting TPMA Talks podcast. Goodbye.